The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UW-M Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. The Economist magazine once characterized Vladimir Putin's foreign policy as, quote, a noxious compound of KGB cynicism and messianic Russian nationalism. If recent parliamentary elections in Russia are an indication, it's an approach that's playing well domestically. Mr. Putin's United Russia Party was the leading vote getter, followed by three main parliamentary allies. These results track with Putin's official approval ratings, which remain at around 80% since his annexation of Crimea. Yet despite his favorable poll numbers and strongman image, Vladimir Putin does not wield absolute power. For a look at the chessboard landscape of Russian domestic politics Putin must navigate, we're joined by Ora John Reuter, Assistant Professor of Political Science at UW-Milwaukee, where his teaching and research focus on authoritarian regimes, Russia, and the former Soviet Union. John, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with a recent quote by a Russian columnist, Oleg Kashin, who says, "Power and the state in Russia are one and the same, and any citizen's participation in politics is not expected." Do you think that's a fair characterization? And what is the role of the electorate?
Well, so Russia does have elections, obviously, but they're elections that are significantly flawed. Public opinion does matter in a regime like Russia. It matters to the extent that the authorities follow public opinion. Election results, they are influenced by public opinion, but on the margins, the authorities take measures to ensure that the results are what the authorities want.
So maybe you could start us off then with a Russian Civics 101 and just talk a little bit about the structure of the government itself.
So yeah, in some ways, I mean, it's not as dissimilar from the structure of the United States government, which a lot of your viewers are probably familiar with. There's a president that's directly elected. There's a bicameral legislature with an upper house that has representatives from all of Russia's regions, which are called subjects, and many of them are called oblasts. And then there's a lower house, similar to our House of Representatives, that's elected, well, part of it is elected on a territorial basis. It differs in some ways in that the Russian government also there's a prime minister in addition to the president. The prime minister is appointed by the president. And there's also a government, which is similar to our cabinet, who's also appointed by the president, subject to the confidence of the Duma.
And Mr. Putin, talk a little bit about where he came from.
So Putin, well, there's a lot there in terms of, so Putin rose to prominence. He was not a well-known figure in the 1990s. He became more well-known in the late Yeltsin years when he was named to be the head of the FSB, Russia's the equivalent to the FBI. And then he really rose to prominence in the very late 1990s and 1999 when President Yeltsin named him Prime Minister of Russia. And then Yeltsin named Putin to be his successor when Yeltsin decided to step down in 1999. And since then, Putin has been very, very popular in Russia. Of course, the state does things to ensure that his popularity remains high. But I think most would agree that even in the absence of any of these measures that the state takes, Putin would be very, very, very would be very popular.
So we tell our students in civics class about the wonderful system of checks and balances built into the U.S. system of governance. Anything comparable in the Russian system, or where is the power really wielded?
Well, it's an interesting question because on paper there are significant checks and balances. So there's in Russia, just like in any country, but especially in Russia, there's a distinction between the power of different actors as it's written down in the Constitution and the power of different actors in practice. So in the Constitution, the president is significantly constrained by Parliament. There's lots of things that the president can't make laws on his own. The Parliament passes laws, just like in the United States. Congress has to pass laws. Many of his key appointments are subject to the approval of the Duma, which is the lower house. And if there's a constitutional court similar to the Supreme Court in the United States, and on paper it has the power to declare laws unconstitutional, just like in the United States. In practice, over the past, it's already been, what now, almost 15 years.
Which is the Putin era.
The Putin era. In practice, in the Putin era, many of these institutions have been weakened because of the overweening role played by the presidential administration, which we sometimes colloquially call the Kremlin. And Putin, of course, is the head of, or he's in charge of the presidential administration. And the presidential administration uses the various tools at its disposal to ensure that those that it supports get elected into the Duma. And so you end up with a Duma, for instance, that is very pliable because it's filled mostly with allies of Putin. The security services play, although sometimes I think in the Western press, the security services, their role is overstated in Russian politics, but still they play a very serious role in allowing the presidential administration to get what it wants.
So talk a little bit about the party system. I mean, United Russia, Mr. Putin's party, enjoyed a landslide victory, but what does the other sort of political party landscape look like?
So because Russia is not a democracy, it's an authoritarian regime, the party system is not necessarily created from the ground up, let's say. It's curated by the Kremlin. So the parties that exist now today in Russia that get a large number of votes, they do so clearly because the Kremlin has said that, yes, we're going to allow these particular parties to get votes. Now, that doesn't mean that those parties, they don't actually have some roots in society. In fact, Russia's second largest party is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And this is a party that was, for many years in the 90s, was the largest party in Russia. It won the most, not a majority, but won the most votes in elections, and certainly has a grassroots presence. Another major party that exists in Russia is called the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which, despite its name, is a far-right nationalist party. It's headed by a guy named Vladimir Putin, who's a scandalous figure, to say the least. They have something of a social base, a far-right nationalist social base. And there's a fourth party that also made it into the latest parliament and was also in the last parliament that was elected in 2007, called Just Russia, Spravedliva Rossiya. And they are, their platform is social democratic, left of center. But again, just to emphasize, all three of these parties, even though they're formally in opposition to the government, they are perceived by most, and I think correctly, as really allies of the Kremlin.
And there were...
The KPRF, the communists, somewhat less so than the other two, but certainly Just Russia and LDP are allies of the Kremlin.
And there's a threshold that you must attain to have a place in Parliament, is there not? And any real opposition parties, to the extent that they exist, didn't make that threshold.
That's right. So many other parties exist in Russia and competed in this election. Some of them with a long history dating back to the 1990s. Others that were just brand new. But all of them in this particular election only got a few percentage of the vote each.
So how closely is United Russia tied to Putin? Is it, they had this landslide victory. What the number is, 343 out of 450 seats they now hold. Is that directly attributable to Putin's popularity, do you think?
In large part, yes. So to answer the first part of your question, so Putin and United Russia are very closely tied. United Russia styles itself as Putin's party. They boast that he founded the party, which is in some measure true. He played a large role in founding the party. He has spoken at almost all of their congresses since the party was founded. in the minds of voters, the two of them are very, very closely tied. That's for sure. It's his party, the ruling party.
So if you're going if you're going to characterize them in sort of broad brush terms, ideologically, how would you do it?
Well, it's actually, I think, it's maybe a misperception for many Westerners who follow events in Russia. They don't realize actually in the Russian political landscape, United Russia and actually Putin's ideology, to the extent he has an ideology, is somewhat right of center, more both economically right of center, pro-market, we say, more pro-Western actually than many other political actors in the political spectrum in Russia. So people do actually, surveys show that people do actually perceive something of an ideology there. They perceive it as, sometimes they call it conservative. It's a conservative ideology. It's a right of center ideology. But it is worth emphasizing that that's not the main feature of their campaign. Their campaign, United Russia's campaign, typically focuses on generalities, improving whatever the overall level of well-being, things like that.
And is there a geographical component? I mean, urban versus rural to both United Russia and, in fact, Mr. Putin's popularity? I mean,
there is, but not maybe perhaps to the extent that you would have in the United States, right, where you have some states, let's say, that have that ideologically strongly support one party or another. In Russia, it's not as extreme as that, but there are some important geographic differences. Recently, this wasn't always the case. Recently, though, there's emerged an urban-rural split. The cities are less supportive of the authorities than rural areas. Part of that, not all of it, but part of that is due to electoral fraud and the use of administrative resources to generate voter turnout in rural areas through non-democratic means.
Well, and we saw...
So there is, anytime we talk in general about kind of patterns of electoral support in Russia, there's always a component that is actually due to the will of the voters, and then a component that is due to various machinations of the state.
Well, and talk a little bit about the protests following the last round of elections in 2011, 2012. There was some fairly significant pushback, was there not?
Yeah, there were large protests, although, I mean, we should keep, there were large protests, and they were indicative of a widespread sentiments of discontent. But we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which those sentiments extended to a majority of the population, certainly not anything larger than that. Surveys show somewhere between 1% and 2% of Russians actually participated in one of those protests. So even though some of them were quite large, reaching up to 100,000 protesters in Moscow, it certainly wasn't all of Russia that was pouring onto the streets protesting, which, in the early 1990s, even then, of course, all of Russia wasn't pouring onto the streets, but it was much larger protests against the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those protests were primarily, though not entirely, but primarily were spearheaded by liberal groups in Moscow who were protesting against electoral fraud in particular. What they failed to do, and this is one reason that I think the protest movement never really took off in Russia, is they failed to link economic grievances to their grievances about political issues.
Well, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about sort of the other centers of power in Russian society. The electorate doesn't seem to be particularly of concern to the regime, but first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're discussing Russian electoral politics with John Reuter from UW-Milwaukee's Political Science Department. Well, we just had this election for the Duma, and we saw relatively low turnout. And again, I think we saw a reflection of that rural and urban split. The turnout in the two largest cities was quite low.
That's right.
And we ended up with really a landslide, as we talked about. So what does that mean in terms of just the Duma's ability to take probably inevitably unpopular decisions in response to the current economic situation?
That's a good question. So this is what's going to happen almost assuredly, is that the Russian government's going to try to pass unpopular reforms now because certain reforms are needed to spur the economy, and they're going to be painful for certain social groups. In particular, we're talking about budget cuts. Now, in terms of whether the low turnout actually delegitimizes the Duma, I'm not so sure that Russians, I think that obviously commentators will draw that link. I'm not sure how resonant that message will be with most Russians. The fact of the matter is, this could change. It always could change, and we always, observers of Russian politics, always think it's about to change. But for the moment, Putin and the government remain very, very, very popular. Actually, after the war, after the annexation of Crimea led to an upswell of patriotism that lifted the popularity ratings of the government, and it's been really surprising that upswell in the regime's popularity hasn't abated yet. Most of the time, these types of things, these upswells in patriotism after conflict, they abate pretty quickly. But this one's been persisting for a while.
So, talk a little bit about the other sort of centers of power. Obviously, there's just the average Russian citizen who casts his vote, and we've talked a little bit about that. But what are some of the other blocks that someone in Mr. Putin's position has to be mindful of?
Yeah, so there are, even though Russia is not necessarily a democracy, there are, just like in a democracy, there are different interest groups, there are different bureaucratic groups that are vying for access to scarce resources. So what Putin has to manage is these different competing interests who all want different things. So sometimes these groups are given names. One common name you hear in the press is the Civics. These are representatives of the force structures, and the idea is that these representatives of the force structures, the Ministry of Defense and the Secret Services and so on and so forth, the security services, they have a particular ideology that's been influenced by their career in the security services, and they lobby for the types of things you would expect: increased spending on defense and security and things like that. There's another group that people sometimes refer to as the liberals. They're the St. Petersburg liberals, the St. Petersburg lawyers. This is a group of people often associated with current Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who have more liberal, especially economic views, and it's commonly thought, although we can't be certain, that they had more influence in the early years of Putin's presidency, and that their influence has waned over time. So there's various groups like that are tied more or less directly to particular corporate interests.
Well, and we certainly hear the term oligarch. Now, what typically would that refer to?
So in the context of Russian politics, it acquired a very specific meaning in the 1990s when it referred to an individual who had become very wealthy very quickly during the transition, taking advantage of the various opportunities that the transition offered. And these wealthy businessmen, in many cases, they translated their economic power into political power. They used their control over large sectors of the economy to begin funding political parties and getting candidates elected into legislatures and so on and things like that. And by the end of the 1990s, some believed, not all, but some believed that these oligarchs were really running Russia, that Yeltsin had essentially become beholden to their will. In the early 2000s, Putin cracked down on these oligarchs. The most famous example of this was in 2003 when he put one of Russia's wealthiest man, well, he didn't, Okay, Russia's wealthiest man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, ended up in jail on charges of tax evasion. It's widely perceived that Putin was behind that decision. And there was also various meetings with the oligarchs in the early 2000s in which Putin laid out a new relationship between the state and the oligarchs. No longer would the oligarchs be able to influence politics. Instead, the state would determine their access to the political process. And since that time, of course, Russia still has lots of very wealthy businessmen, and many of them have a great degree of political power. But now the situation is that they owe their political influence to their ability to access Putin, to access the Kremlin, and not to their own kind of autonomous empires.
So going forward then, what are there any significant threats to his position, to his authority?
Well, I mean, prognosticators prognosticate, but well, there is always, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, we, as political scientists, have time and time again predicted that various economic crises that Russia has suffered through since 2008 would adversely affect Putin's popularity, and that this would lead to more protest against the regime. But it hasn't happened like we thought. Still could happen. Of course, the economy is still it's now not in recession anymore. At least it's stagnating now, but it's not in free fall as it was a few months ago and last year. But the economy is not doing well, so it certainly is possible that economic stagnation will lead to a reduction in his popularity ratings. The other huge thing, the other important thing that you have to talk about, of course, when you talk about Putin's popularity and the survivability of the regime in Russia is oil prices. And of course, they've been low now for several years. Everyone who studies Russian politics basically agrees that Putin, in large part, owes his rise to the rapid increase in oil prices that was occurring at the very end of the 1990s and in the early 2000s and throughout most of the 2000s. And so you would expect, okay, when oil prices go down, then he might lose some of his popularity and thereby authority. But again, oil prices have been low for a while, and the regime has been able, in various ways, to adapt to this new reality. So it's also not impossible they'll find new ways to adapt to this new reality.
Well, sort of discussions of national character are always problematic, certainly, but is there something about the Russians' long sweep of history that favor a system like this, where stability and a strong leader at the top are preferable to the kind of chaotic mix of democracy?
Some would certainly argue something like that, and I'll give you that version of that argument that's often offered. But I'll give you that with a caveat, which is it's very hard to verify such a story, to find out, through public opinion data that yes, there are some cultural values that Russians hold, and this is the cause of not just their current attitudes, but maybe of the macro political phenomena that we observe. But one version of this cultural story, and there are others, there are many versions of the cultural story, but one version that maybe is slightly more persuasive than others is that there has been so much turmoil and instability in Russia over the centuries that Russians really value stability. Of course, the Russian Revolution, and then 1991, the instability and the economic dislocation of the 1990s. Because of all this, Russians have learned that they're fearful of unrest and instability, and they're willing to sacrifice many things in order to ensure stability. And now, this cultural narrative you can see clearly, I think, even if we social scientists are sometimes skeptical of such narratives, or at least we want to put them under the microscope, you can see that Putin very much believes in this narrative, because a lot of the language that he uses in order to attract supporters sounds like this. He says, well, he contrasts his rule in the 2000s with the chaotic 1990s. and warns voters, that if the opposition comes to power, we could have a return to the instability and chaos of the 1990s.
So, well, we've got under a minute left, but I'm wondering, looking forward, is there any logical and natural successor to Mr. Putin at this point, or is that completely up in the air?
It's not clear. No, there's not. I mean, I won't even speculate about that. Of course we could, but I think such speculation is useless at this point. At this point, I think, the good money is on him running for president again in 2018, which he's allowed to do under the current rules, and serving, well, we'll see if he serves his full 6-year term. But he clearly is planning, I think, on doing that, and therefore he's not giving any clear signals about who his successor would be, because this is something for the distant future.
Well, Ora John Reuter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,